This is America, and this is the U.S. Congress, which holds the purse strings for the U.S. Defense Department. The Defense Secretary is asking Congress for an urgent infusion of $67 billion to fund the war with Iran. But this request comes as the war is growing more unpopular. Can Congress rein in military spending? I'll have more on that in just a moment. But first, here's Alex Marquardt in our Washington, D.C. studio.
Thank you, Matthew. We are almost 5 months into America's war against Iran, and in just the past week, 4 more American service members were killed. Hundreds have been wounded in the past few months. And as that human cost keeps growing, so too does the financial bill. The Pentagon says it is $37.5 billion so far, and the Defense Secretary is now urgently asking Congress for $67 billion more dollars. The president had promised that the so-called excursion, as he called it, in Iran would last only 4 to 5 weeks, and that he would lead a stronger military and get into no more endless wars. The Pentagon is already reportedly cutting training and maintenance in order to free up cash. And just this week, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives voted to stop the war without congressional approval. So what is this war costing America in money, in readiness, in lives, and in reputation? And how much longer will Congress keep signing the checks?
You're requesting roughly $68 billion for the department through this supplemental, correct?
67, yes.
And yesterday, your department stated publicly, quote, U.S. forces struck Iranian military command centers, maritime capabilities, missile and drone launch sites, and air defense systems to degrade Iran's ability to continue attacking commercial vessels. That was a press release from your department. Is that a broadly accurate characterization of ongoing operations?
That sounds broadly accurate, yes.
In the second week of the conflict, you stated that Iran's military had been, quote, destroyed and, quote, made combat ineffective. Was that an accurate statement? Yes or no?
Iran's ability to challenge the United States of America at the level at which we're capable of.
That's not what I asked you, Mr. Secretary. You said on day 14, Iran's military had been, quote, destroyed and, quote, made combat ineffective. Yes or no? Was that an accurate statement?
What the American military has done to the Iranian military is a historic military defeat,
and they're
ineffective in that context.
So despite the Defense Secretary's assessment of Iran being destroyed and rendered combat ineffective months ago, U.S. forces remain deployed, and that comes at a steep cost. Let's take a look. $11.3 billion were spent in just the first week of the war. That's more than $1 billion a day, according to the Defense Department. And then on May 12th, Pentagon officials estimated that a month of the campaign had cost some $29 billion. And then on Wednesday this week, Hegseth said that the war's cost will be $37.5 billion. That's just until September. But other analyses, including one by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, puts that figure at closer to $42 billion already. So how do we get to a figure that large with billions needed to continue? Bernard Smith explains.
That single rocket launch cost nearly $29 million. The SM-3 is the US military's most expensive weapon. It's an interceptor. It's used so far as many as 250 of them in the war against Iran. So it needs to replenish depleted stocks of these and all sorts of material. In fact, the Defense Secretary says he needs as much as $70 billion in extra cash to pay for the Iran war and the military's future needs.
On the readiness front, we requested $21 billion. This will fund military pay, replace much of the equipment utilized during recent operations, sustain forward-deployed forces, and grow personnel and strength while stabilizing mission-critical fuel shortfalls and supporting the National Guard. On the capabilities side, we requested $46 billion. These funds will expand production lines and accelerate delivery of high-demand munitions.
The US military has spent upwards of $15 billion on offensive missiles and defensive interceptors in the Iran war. It's taken 6 months to burn through these weapons. It'll take up to 4 years to replace them. And then there's the cost of the people needed to fire these weapons and otherwise keep the war machine rumbling on. It costs $30 million a day to keep the 50,000 or so military personnel in the Middle East fed, housed, and combat ready. Pete Hegseth says the Iran war alone has so far cost $37.5 billion. Now, to give you a bit of perspective, that's more than NASA's entire annual budget, 4 times the Centers for Disease Control budget, and nearly half the entire federal education budget. War is hell, General William Sherman is said to have told military graduates 150 years ago. It's also very expensive. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera, Washington.
And to dig into all these numbers, I'm joined now by Mark Cancain, who is a former Pentagon official and now a senior advisor with the CSIS think tank, and Matthew Kroenig, the vice president for Geostrategy at the Atlantic Council. Mark, Matthew, thank you both so much for being with me today. It's a big week in this war against Iran. I want to start with the top line. You saw Bernard there comparing this $37.5 billion request with some other budget lines in the U.S. budget. Mark, to you first. Your think tank, CSIS, thinks that that is low, in fact.
Well, we put the cost of the war at about 40, 42, and it's creeping up, of course, every day. One of the things that causes confusion is that the supplementals don't completely cover the cost of the war. They have a lot of other things in there. The administration has also not been terribly transparent. So it's difficult to put an exact number on it, but I think 40, 42 is in the ballpark.
So without that transparency, do we understand how they reached that figure?
The short answer is no. We know what's in the supplemental, but there's a lot of items in there that are not related to the war, but are related to initiatives that the Pentagon wants to get started on. Some of them are focused, for example, on China.
And when Hegseth sat in front of Congress, Matthew, he described this request as urgent and necessary in order to restock the Pentagon's arsenal. We mentioned that the Washington Post reported that the Pentagon is already curbing some training and maintenance in order to free up some cash. So when you hear the defense secretary talking about this urgent request, do you feel that it is urgent?
I think it is urgent. The United States has expended a lot of its stockpile of munitions, both by assisting Ukraine over the years and now in the war in Iran. And I think it would be very hard for Democrats or others to vote against this, essentially voting against giving the U.S. military the weapons they need at a time we're at war. Another point I'd make is I actually think these are pretty small numbers we're talking about. The entire Pentagon budget is this year's $1.5 trillion is what the president has requested. So $38 billion is 2% of that number. Essentially, the entire budget is to deal with Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. So 2.5% to deal with Iran seems reasonable to me.
So this $67.5 billion request, that's supposed to take these war efforts through September. The timeline, of course, has been a real subject of contention. Here's a little bit of what various Trump administration officials have said about the timeline for this war in Iran. Take a listen.
You said it would be over soon. Are you thinking this week it will be over?
No,
Are you talking
but soon.
about days?
I think soon.
Okay, and with respect
Very soon. You know, you never like to say too early you won. We won. We won the bet. In the first hour, it was over.
We are on or ahead of schedule in that operation and expect to conclude it at the appropriate time here in a matter of weeks, not months.
You know, I don't like to say this. We've won this. This war has been won.
Fundamentally, the military objectives of the United States have been completed. So that means, as the president has said, very shortly this war is going to conclude.
I think it's close to over. Yeah, I mean, I view it as very close to over.
You say very close. How soon? Could the deal happen before the midterm elections?
Oh, absolutely.
So this shortfall, if you will, the needed extra funds, Mark, do you think that is because this war is dragging on longer than expected, or is it mismanagement of a budget?
Well, it's going on longer than expected, and the problem is pots of money. In other words, DoD is having to draw on operations money, and as a result, that's getting low. It needs congressional approval to move money from other areas like procurement into those areas. And of course, their preference is to add money to make up what was spent on the war.
But as Matthew pointed out, the budget is $1 trillion. And so it does seem rather surprising, I think, to many viewers and many American voters that the Pentagon would be short on cash.
Well, the problem is that by law, the money comes in chunks, and you can't move money from one place to another. For example, you can't move from procurement into operations without congressional approval. So because they've drawn down operations money for the war, they can't move money from all these other places in there without congressional approval. And of course, that has become a focal point for opposition to the war.
So it's not like the Pentagon's just getting a piggy bank full of $1 trillion, that the money has been specifically allocated for different lanes within the defense budget.
Absolutely. And there are hundreds and hundreds of different line items, and to move money between any of them requires congressional approval.
A very, very important note. So given that we don't know anything more about the timeline, this is certainly not winding down. In fact, it's ramping up, Matthew. Can we expect to see Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth going up to Capitol Hill, essentially hat in hand, again and again, asking for more money?
Well, I agree with the premise of your question. It is hard to tell a story about how this ends anytime soon. You know, one possibility would be that Trump just walks away, but that would leave Iran in control of the Strait of Hormuz. That's really unacceptable. You know, the other way would be that Iran gives up its claims over sovereignty of the Strait of Hormuz, but they've been very stubborn on that. And so if neither side are willing to budge, I think we are going to see a continuation of this conflict for the foreseeable future. And so, yes, that will cost more money. That requires munitions. It does require, there are also costs in terms of maintenance and just training that's not taking place. So I think the cost will continue to mount.
So in your view, this is binary, either walk away or essentially get the job done. But we have heard so many different objectives. Initially, it was to weaken the regime enough so that the people could rise up and essentially bring about regime change. Take out the conventional weapons that would weaken their force posture across the region. Stop the nuclear program. And then, of course, open the Strait of Hormuz, which I think we would all agree right now is kind of the most critical issue. So when you say either walk away or escalate, what would you like to see in terms of that escalation?
Yeah, well, and I think the administration went in with the goal of weakening the regime and degrading the military, and I think they've done that. And then now Iran's retaliated by taking control and stopping shipping through the strait. And so that's really the big remaining problem that needs to be addressed before we stop. In terms of escalation, I think we've seen some of the options the administration has. One is reconstituting this blockade and continuing to choke off the regime economically. Second is return to airstrikes going against energy and infrastructure. And there's some creative options also to get the strait open. Mark and I were just talking about some of those. There's naval escorts, of course. There's also denying Iran's denial strategy. Can the United States use drones and other new technology to prevent Iran's control of its own coast? So I understand the Pentagon is working up options and does think it has some options for trying to force the strait back open.
We have not seen any indication that through force, the regime thinking has changed in any way or that they are bending in any way. It's actually been quite the opposite. They have shown that they have become tougher, if you will, in these conversations. So, Mark, have you seen any indication in terms of the options that the Pentagon and the administration are looking at that perhaps boots on the ground would be something to step up the escalatory measures?
Well, you're certainly correct that putting pressure on the regime has not worked so far. They're willing to make their population endure terrible hardships in order to maintain their course. But it's possible to open the strait. It would be a major military operation, as Matthew indicated. You'd have Navy ships escorting. You'd have attacks on the mainland. You might have boots on the ground, but only in the islands. You wouldn't see boots on the ground on the mainland. The Iranians still have a very powerful land force, up to 1 million troops, and we have not been targeting that. We've been targeting the Air Force, the Navy, the Republican Guards, Revolutionary Guards, but not the Army.
Of course, this is happening in a highly political environment. We're just a few months ahead of the midterms, and support for this war is dropping. I want to take a look at some of those numbers, and this comes from Politico. According to Politico, 46% of Republican voters said that the cost was still worth it. That was back in May, but just 11% of Democratic voters said the same. Now in July, just 32% of Republican voters showed support for that spending. For Democratic voters, it went down to 7%. Then when you look at Donald Trump's base, in May, 50% of MAGA voters said that the war was worth the cost. By July, that fell to just 37%, so 13 points down. Now, Donald Trump does not have congressional approval for this war. Matthew, how difficult do you think this is getting politically for the president?
Well, I think it is getting difficult politically. And, you know, we often say that American voters don't pay attention to foreign policy. One of the big exceptions is an unpopular war, especially a war where Americans are dying. And we have seen some additional casualties in recent days. And then it's also affecting, of course, inflation and the economy. And that's what voters care about most. So I think this likely will have an effect on the midterm elections. You know, what's interesting, just a couple of days ago, the president was asked about this, and he said, "Oh, I don't care about the elections. I care about doing the right thing." And if you look at his behavior, it suggests that that is how he thinks. He's doing what he thinks he needs to do in the Middle East, and doesn't seem very concerned about how this is going to affect November's elections.
You did note the human cost. I mentioned earlier 4 service members killed. That was just this week. I believe it's more than 400 wounded so far. Mark, that human cost, not just in symbolism, but treatment and everything else that comes along with perhaps replacing that personnel. How are those human costs taken and personnel costs taken into consideration by the Pentagon and really now by the country politically?
Well, the Pentagon was clear from the beginning that if you're going to fight a war, you're going to take casualties. And that continues to be true. And I'm sure that General Cancain made that point when they were discussing war plans. And people need to keep that in mind. There's no such thing as a bloodless war. We may go a week without any casualties. That's wonderful. But sooner or later, the Iranians were going to get lucky and cause more casualties. So that goes with the territory. It's important to keep in mind, though, that the level of casualties by the standards of warfare are very low. In Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, you know, we were losing about 1,000 killed a year. This is much, much lower than that.
So the president has not gone to Congress for approval. There was a vote earlier this week that was primarily Democrats saying that he has to come up to the Hill and ask for that approval, and there were enough Republicans who crossed the aisle to get that through the House. It's now being rejected by the Senate. It has stopped short of restricting the Pentagon funding, that is Congress. So how much leverage does Congress actually have over this conflict with Iran? Matthew Torres explains.
The president serves as commander-in-chief, but only Congress can declare war, which has formally done so 11 times across 5 conflicts in U.S. history. Congress controls military spending, which gives it significant leverage over operations. One example was the Vietnam War. As costs soared and public support declined, Congress started to limit funding for combat operations, and by 1973 ended funding for the war. After the 1993 Black Hawk Down mission in Somalia, Congress threatened to cut funding unless the Clinton administration approved a troop withdrawal timeline. The Iraq War was different. Congress tried several times to use funding to force a withdrawal, but those efforts failed. In 2007, President Bush vetoed a bill that required a withdrawal timetable, and Congress later passed a version without it. Cutting off war funding can be politically difficult. Critics argue it could endanger U.S. troops already on the ground, weaken military leaders, shift the blame to Congress if the conflict worsens, or signal weakness to adversaries. The debate has returned as Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth seeks billions more for the war in Iran. Republicans control both chambers of Congress, but the war is growing more unpopular ahead of the midterm elections. Will Congress limit funding or assert a greater role in deciding how the war is fought? For now, Democrats are pursuing action to challenge the administration's course, while House Republicans are backing additional funding. But some Senate Republicans who are also skeptical say they need to play a greater role. Lawmakers face a political question as much as a constitutional one. How far are they willing to challenge the commander-in-chief who controls the military but depends on Congress to fund it? Matthew Torres, Al Jazeera, Washington.
There is a significant debate raging, and it's not just because of this conflict, but because of what we're seeing in Ukraine as well with Russia. When you look at the costs that have been incurred so far during this war, is the concern, how much concern is there, Matthew, about, first of all, using up the stockpiles of some very, very significant weaponry and replacing that?
That is part of the concern, because the United States has some really exquisite, expensive weapons, and we've seen instances where the United States is using a multi-million-dollar, Patriot interceptor to shoot down a cheap drone, and that doesn't really make sense. So I think there is a lot of momentum toward trying to get those costs down. We've just seen a major U.S. weapons providers say they're going to provide a Patriot interceptor at a fraction of that cost. Also looking at new technology, drones and other things for counter unmanned systems. And so I think that one of the upsides maybe of this war and the war in Ukraine will be shifting the way the United States produces and procures weapons.
How depleted have the stocks become?
Well, I don't have the numbers handy. Maybe Mark and his team do, but I think there are real concerns given, again, what we've provided to the Ukrainians and what we've used in Iran. And already, if, say, China were to attack Taiwan, even before this conflict, I think there were real concerns about whether the United States is ready. And I think the readiness is even lower now than it was just a few months ago.
Mark, how was that preparedness?
We looked at 7 munitions that have been used heavily against Iran and that would be used in a war in the Western Pacific. And we've used between a third and half of those munitions. Now, that means that half to 2/3 are still remaining. These won't be constraints on the current conflict with Iran, but the risk is, as Matthew pointed out, if there were a conflict in the Western Pacific, even going into the war, inventories were considered inadequate. Now they're even further behind. It's going to take 1 to 5 years just to get back to where we were, and then a couple of years after that to get to where war planners want to be. There's going to be a window of vulnerability there.
How much of a shift are you seeing toward away from these bigger, more expensive systems to these smaller, more nimble ones like these sea drones, for example, that have just been rolled out for the first time by the U.S., I should note, in this conflict?
What you see in warfare is a move towards a high-low mix. You see that in Ukraine. You see that with Iran. That is, the high end is ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. The low end are these cheap drones. The United States is moving towards that also, where we have some long-range, very expensive munitions, and then we have less expensive, very inexpensive drones. It's important to keep in mind, though, that drones may be much less expensive. They're also very easy to shoot down. We've shot down maybe 90%, sometimes even 95% of the Iranian drones. Drones also don't carry as much of a punch. They have about 100 pounds of explosive. A ballistic missile will have 1,000 pounds. So it's not one or the other. It's a mix. They're complementary.
Matthew, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Israel, which obviously was America's partner in getting into this war. There was a report in the New York Times that it was Netanyahu who personally convinced the Trump administration to join him on this quest, if you will. Israel, to me, it appears to be on the sidelines right now. We heard the finance minister, Smotrich, saying they have no interest in getting back to any kind of fighting alongside the U.S. What is Israel doing, and what do you think they should be doing?
Well, I think that you're right that they're staying on the sidelines for now. And I think the United States and Israel always had a little bit of a different objective in this war for the United States. I think it was more about degrading the Iranian military. I think early on, anyway, Israel really was hoping for regime collapse, and they were the ones involved on the strikes directly against the supreme leader. I think long term, they would still hold out the hope for a different, better government in Iran. I think they're also seeing that that's probably less likely now than maybe Netanyahu or others hoped before. And then, of course, Israel also has the issue in Lebanon to deal with, and it's been taking some military action against Hezbollah there. So I think Israel's, as you put it, kind of on the sidelines for now, but always possible that they could get involved in the future.
Is this an inflection point, Mark? What does it tell us about the fact that the administration is essentially promising cheaper warfare and leaning into that kind of warfare while at the same time asking for some $67.5 billion just for another few months?
I think what you're seeing is a recognition about what it takes to fight a protracted conflict. We started seeing that with Ukraine when we sent large amounts of munitions and supplies and weapons to Ukraine, but got to the point where we couldn't send any more because we couldn't produce them fast enough. We didn't have enough in our own inventories. And that began thinking about enhancing the industrial base, increasing the production capability of key items. You're seeing more of that now. Protracted conflicts, as with Iran, and especially as what might happen with China, take a lot of munitions, and we have to have the industrial capacity and the stockpiles to be able to carry out a conflict like that.
Well, this certainly does feel like a moment, not just on that front, but also in terms of where this fight is going, whether the president is trying to get to Iran to a place to just come back to the table, or whether things are really going to escalate. Thank you both so much for joining me today. This fascinating discussion. Mark Cancain from CSIS and Matthew Kroenig from the Atlantic Council. That's all from me and the team here in Washington. I want to hand it back to Matthew Torres and Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha.
We'll be back tomorrow with another edition of This is America. That's at 18:30 GMT or 2:30 p.m. Eastern here in the U.S. We'll see you then.